Upper Echelon is brought to you by Deloitte for innovative thinking and thorough strategic planning. Turn to Deloitte. Well, in the Upper Echelon slot this week, Michael Jordaan, the Chief Executive of FNB, a member of the Executive Committee at First Rand, and an innovative thinker who actually started off his career in Germany. Interesting that, Michael. What took you from South Africa to go and learn how to, first of all, speak German and then to serve people in a bank as a teller over there?
Alex, thanks for having me. I had a German grandmother, and at a time where there were sanctions against South Africa and it was difficult to travel, this was the one place where my father could go to do his PhD. So I spent the first 2 or 3 years of my life in Germany, learned German, but then promptly forgot it as we came back to South Africa.
So you're from an academic family.
Yes, I think it was one of the ethos that was imprinted on our family from an early age is work hard, and that learning and education is something that will really enable you in life. So I come from a rare family where both my grandfathers had 2 PhDs each.
And you followed them.
Well, I eventually got to one, and that was enough for me.
But it was interesting that the subject that you chose, bank supervision, because if there's one area that South Africa shines in, it is the soundness of our banks. The latest World Economic Forum report puts us number 2 in the world. You're in banking. You've been running a big bank for a while. I guess you got to doff your cap once in a while to Errol Kruger.
Yes, I think the quality of banking supervision in South Africa has been superb. That doesn't always mean it's easy for us that are being regulated. But if I had to give my words for how Errol was as a banking supervisor, he was very tough, but he was always fair. And you can't just judge him on a day-to-day basis. You look back at the South African banking sector now, it's well capitalized. We haven't had a credit boom. And we, in fact, rated the 4th best banking system in the world by the World Economic Forum.
Second.
Is
we
it
made
now
number
the second?
2 this year. Yeah, we're number 2 behind Canada, would you believe it? But Michael, having certainty as far as regulation is concerned, having this, even though the regulators are tough, must also promote innovation on the other hand, because at least you know where the lines are.
That's exactly right. Certainty is something that markets want, and obviously it's something that you want in an industry. Clearly, you can also get too much certainty and too much regulation. I think there's a fear that may happen in the rest of the world, after the horse is bolted. And we have to be aware in South Africa that we also have different challenges. If I can just use but one example, FICA is very good regulation. It stops money laundering, but it would be a pity if that were a barrier to banking the unbanked in South Africa, for example.
Well, that's something that you spent a lot of time thinking about, and we'll get onto that in a moment. Paul Harris started a program, Class of, at RMB. You were a member there. I read on the internet, addressed the Class of, so clearly it's still going into the future. But what about Paul himself? You served as his personal assistant for a period in time. Did he have much influence on your career?
Yes, it was one of the most interesting periods of my life. I was, of course, terrified when Paul approached me one day and said, "Do you want to be my assistant?" I'd never contemplated that. I didn't know, what it would entail. But in that period of working so closely with an individual, one learns an immense amount. I joke about it, but I do think, apart from all the detail, I do know how his mind works, and that in some cases I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. That having been said, after working so intensely with somebody for a year, it was also great when I stopped being his assistant, because then you can mix what you've learned with a little bit of your own foundation.
Did you go to all the meetings with him? Is that part of the process?
The only ones where I was excluded would involve those where it was of a personal or a HR nature. In other words, the direct meetings that he had with his reports.
And have you done the same yourself? Have you got
I've done the same. So it's become a habit of mine to choose a youngster, usually from a disadvantaged background as well, to accompany me everywhere. And all meetings are open, all emails can be read, and it's obviously I derive benefit from that myself, but I think it's a great way of mentoring people as well.
Michael, I know you're a great reader. Ricardo Semler's book Maverick and the 7-Day Weekend, and Lars Collin, a gent that I met recently who wrote a book called The Second Cycle. These are revolutionary, innovative ways of thinking. Now, given that you run a big bank, which banks are not known for their revolutionary ways of thinking, they're more known for their hierarchical structures. Are any of these ways or approaches starting to influence the approach you would have to FNB?
can only tell by people who join us after having served at other banks, and they all remark on how different our culture is. It's a family type of culture, and while there is some form of hierarchy, one needs to organize in some way or another, the culture is incredibly non-hierarchical, and we rely a great deal on empowerment. What you must do in a modern organization is to surround yourself with people that are better than you. But not only that, then you need to empower them and give them the entrepreneurial freedom to perform. And that's by and large what we try and do. And that has been the secret of our success.
Have you read Semler's books?
Yes, I have. And he was a big influence in my life early on. But I like to read widely as well. There's so many great thinkers coming out in the world right now. And I have to tell you, I'm also an addict of TED. TED really makes me feel as if you can live anywhere in the world, could be in Moy River, and still you're at the center of the universe.
Sounds like Moy River's on the outskirts of the universe. But certainly the philosophy there of reading widely rather, would give you a couple of favorites in the management field. Do you read Gary Hamel? Do you like his work?
Yes, I like Gary Hamel. I think he made one mistake in one of his books. He said what a great company Enron was, only to be disproved later. But I suppose that happens with all of us. You can't be right all the time.
Well, remember, In Search of Excellence.
Exactly. But Jim Collins is one of those books, The Good to Great, that I think has made a big impression on a number of business leaders, merely because he speaks so much of humility and that you must actually channel the ambition that a leader needs to have into the business and not into your own ego. So there are lots of good lessons to be learned from reading widely and wildly, as you say.
Michael, what about the whole innovative area? I remember talking to Paul Harris in the early days of eBucks once he'd thought about this idea, or perhaps you guys within the bank had discussed it, and he was so excited about it. He actually gave you the responsibility for bringing it to life.
RMB's always been a very innovative bank because it wasn't aligned to any large group in those days of the conglomerate. So their payoff line even is innovative ideas and traditional values. And when we then eventually merged with FNB, the investment bankers actually realized that we knew nothing about running a retail or a commercial bank. And the only thing that we could bring to the party was a new culture and still a new way of thinking, and innovation was very much a part of that. Now, I have to admit, it took us a long time. You don't just walk into a company and change the culture. But what we're seeing today is wave after wave of innovations. And as so often happens in innovations, one good idea builds on another good idea. We, for example, wouldn't have had our 15% fuel rewards had it not been for eBucks, or we wouldn't have launched a banking application for smartphones had it not been that somebody decided to apply for a telecommunications license. So I'm very excited as I sit here after 7 years of being CEO, seeing the innovations that are just bubbling up to the top. And I have to tell you, I personally have very little to do with it. We just have great people that come up with great ideas.
Does it help being younger?
I think initially people don't necessarily take you that seriously, particularly when we started with the innovation program. As with any other form of change management, people are skeptical. But then if year after year they see that the campaign continues, and in our case, where we give prizes of R1 million, if anybody comes up with a good idea that implements it, that starts changing it. And then the cynicism falls away. And I think it's also possible then to be slightly more inspirational for the youngsters. South Africa, after all, is quite a young society. And if you look at the average employee at the FNB, it's a very young person.
Michael, this whole thing about being a young achiever, and you reached, you ran this huge big bank at the age of 36. You had enormously important jobs even before the age of 30 within the organization. There's always a danger, though, that young achievers don't kick on. How have you managed to handle that?
Well, first of all, I have to say I get my kicks out of giving challenges to people and then watching them perform. And more often than not, if you make the right decision about individuals, they will outperform not only your expectations, but even what they thought their own capabilities and constraints were. Now clearly, things could go wrong in a later stage, but I think that has everything to do with attitude. If you are engaged in any type of topic that you're passionate about, you may be passionate about journalism and about media, then work is no longer work. It's something that you look forward to every day when you wake up. And then I think your risk of failure is much lower. I think one of the things that does happen to us as we get older is that our risk propensity reduces. You know, the moment you have kids, your risk propensity reduces quite significantly. And that's something that's quite important in an entrepreneurial culture. And the way that we try and do it is just to make sure that the incentives are still properly aligned so that when people outperform, that they're incentivized to do well.
There's also a theory, though, that a CEO can outlive his usefulness in an organization. Now, you've been running the bank. You're only 43 this year. You've been running it for 7 years already. If you were a Warren Buffett clone, you'd be there for at least another 40 years. But is that on your mind?
I think there comes a time where every CEO needs to make way for the next person, because at some stage your ideas become stale and you start forgiving people that maybe get a little bit too close to you. And I've always said that the maximum time really should be 10 years. I'm sure there are exceptions. Remember, Warren Buffett isn't really a managing CEO. He's rather a very astute investor. But if you manage a business on a day-to-day basis, even if you think you're doing a great job, 10 years should be the maximum, and then you should move on.
So if you're hands-on, then watch out. But if you are doing a Yanni Mouton or a Warren Buffett and people like maybe your colleagues, Larry Dippenaar, Paul Harris, as long as you are inspiring rather than
Indeed, but there are ways of doing that that doesn't necessarily mean having a day-to-day control. I mean, we're very fortunate that we still have Larry as a chairman, quite an active chairman, but at any given time I can pick up the phone to GT or to Paul or Viv Bartlett, who used to run the bank before me, and they'll give very sage advice based on their practical experience. But they too will probably tell you about the benefit of handing over the baton, and the best way to do that is in a seamless way. You know, in a way that people don't even know that they're missing you.
Michael, do you speak fluent German?
I used to be able to, because after I completed my studies, I went back to Germany and I worked at Deutsche Bank for 3 years. It helped that I had a German girlfriend at the time. That's the best way to learn a language. But ever since I've returned to South Africa, I must admit my German's become very rusty.
What about Asia, Mandarin? I was just thinking, if you have an affinity for languages, that must be one that you'd be considering learning.
It's very interesting you ask this question today, because my 3 young daughters are going for their first Mandarin lesson today. So I suppose by saying that, I'm admitting that I'm getting a little bit old to learn new languages at least. But I certainly think Mandarin is a very important language for the future, and that's why we're encouraging them to do that.
Where did that come from? Sending your kids, how old are they, Michael?
They're very young still, so 4, 5, and 7. But of course, languages are very easy to learn when you're young. It would be easy for them to learn another Germanic language, but something as Chinese apparently is very difficult. But it teaches you not only a language, it teaches you so much about the entire culture. And given that it's a culture in its ascendance, one that's certainly going to shape world history for the next 100, 200 years, who knows what will happen thereafter. I just think that's a great gift that you can give to your children, is another language.
Are you hoping that they'll follow in your footsteps?
I hope that they are ambitious, but they're ambitious in any field. So if my daughter says that, you know, she wants to become a ballerina, my second one now at the moment wants to be a rock star, whatever it is that they choose, I just like to know that they make their little dent in the world one day.
Oh, rock star singing in Chinese. I mean, that certainly gives all kinds of potential opportunities. Michael, just to close off with, you are a very public persona. You tweet a lot on Twitter, more than 5,500 followers, which is almost as many as the whole of MoneyWeb has got. So you really have made an effort in that field. Why is social media, in your opinion, so relevant that you would dedicate so much time to it?
Alec, I actually don't see myself as a very public persona. And in fact, I revel in being anonymous. There's nothing I like more than just, not shaving over a weekend and not caring about, what clothes I wear or, who I see. But I must say that the Twitter bug is something that has bitten me. I'm quite addicted to social media. I like the immediacy of it, finding out news, long before it's printed in the media, for example. But it's also been a great opportunity to just share thoughts. And in that case, I like the brevity of it. I'm not big on any other form of social media, let's say Facebook. I would find it too cumbersome to write longer blogs or articles. But if something interesting happens to me on the day, or if there's an interesting thought that's presented to me, it really is my way of keeping a diary and sharing it with the world. And I must say, I am quite amazed at there are other people that are also interested in it. I would do it even if no one followed me.
Michael Jordaan is the Chief Executive of FNB. And Upper Echelon was brought to you by Deloitte for innovative thinking and thorough strategic planning. Turn to Deloitte.